A tiny scratch on your shin doesn't feel like a death sentence. Today, you'd probably ignore it or, at most, slap on a Band-Aid and some Neosporin. But 50,000 years ago, that same scratch was a ticking time bomb. One day it's a bit red, the next it's throbbing, and by the end of the week, you're shaking with a fever that no amount of medicinal herbs can break. For the vast majority of our history, the line between minor inconvenience and biological game over was razor thin. We've all grown up hearing the same grim statistic: ancient people died at 30. It paints a picture of a world filled with teenagers and 20-somethings, where hitting your 31st birthday was a miracle of biblical proportions. But that number is actually one of the biggest statistical illusions in human history. To understand why our ancestors died young, we first have to realize that they didn't actually age faster. They weren't elderly at 25. The life expectancy of 30 is a mathematical average, and averages can be incredibly misleading. If you have two people and one dies at age 70 while the other dies at birth, their average life expectancy is 35. Does that mean everyone in that group died at 35? Not at all. It means the beginning of life was so dangerous that it dragged the average down into the dirt. For ancient humans, the real struggle wasn't necessarily surviving to old age. It was surviving to age 5. The first 5 years of a human life were a literal gauntlet. Without modern medicine, vaccines, or a clear understanding of germ theory, the world was a minefield for an infant. A simple bout of dehydration from a stomach bug wasn't just a rough weekend for the parents, it was frequently fatal. According to the Science Learning Hub, things we consider trivial today, like a mild fever or a cough, were the leading causes of death for children. There were no antibiotics to fight off a chest infection, and no clean, sterilized water bottles to prevent the spread of parasites. If you could make it past that 5th birthday, your chances of seeing 60 or 70 were actually quite high. We see this in the fossil record. Elderly skeletons with arthritis and worn-down joints who lived long, full lives. But for every one of those elders, there were countless children who never got the chance to grow up. For those who did survive childhood, the threats shifted from invisible viruses to the brutal reality of a world without a safety net. Imagine you're a young adult in the prime of your life. You're fast, you're strong, and you're a vital part of your tribe. But then, you develop a toothache. Today, that's a painful trip to the dentist and a few $100s out of your pocket. For an ancient human, a deep cavity or an abscessed tooth was a death warrant. Without the ability to treat the infection, the bacteria from that single tooth could seep into the jawbone and eventually enter the bloodstream, causing sepsis. It's a terrifying thought. You could survive a hunt against a woolly mammoth, only to be taken down by a piece of grit in your breakfast. Your teeth weren't just tools for eating, they were potential biological bombs sitting right in your skull. Then, there was the sheer physical risk of the job. For millions of years, being a human meant being an athlete 24/7. Whether you were a hunter-gatherer or an early farmer, your daily routine involved heavy lifting, sprinting, and navigating treacherous terrain. One bad fall during a hunt or a miscalculated jump across a ravine could result in a broken leg. In the wild, a broken leg doesn't just mean a cast and crutches. It means you can't hunt, you can't gather, and you can't run from the things that want to eat you. While we have incredible evidence, like the famous Old Man of Shanidar, showing that tribes often took care of their injured members, many weren't so lucky. A permanent injury often meant a slow decline into malnutrition or becoming the easiest target on the savannah. For the women of the ancient world, there was an even more persistent shadow following them: childbirth. This was the original front line of human survival. Without the guidelines provided by organizations like the WHO or the CDC today, and certainly without the option of a C-section or sterile surgical tools, bringing new life into the world was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. Complications that we treat with a routine procedure today were insurmountable obstacles 10,000 years ago. If the baby was in the wrong position, or if an infection set in after delivery, the results were almost always tragic for both mother and child. It is a sobering fact that for most of history, the leading cause of death for women in their prime wasn't predators or famine. It was the very act that ensured the species continued. You might think that as humans started to settle down and invent agriculture, things got easier. We built houses, we stayed in one place, and we grew our own food. Surely that meant we lived longer, right? Surprisingly, the opposite was often true. When we stopped moving and started living in crowded early settlements, we accidentally created a paradise for pathogens. Living in close quarters with other people, and more importantly, with domesticated animals, allowed diseases to jump from species to species and spread like wildfire. Our water sources became contaminated with waste, and without a garbage truck to haul away the filth, early cities became breeding grounds for the next big plague. We traded the danger of the leopard in the grass for the danger of the cholera in the well. It was the ultimate civilization trap. When we look at these skeletons today, we don't just see data points or low averages. We see the resilience of a species that had to fight for every single year of life. We see a mother who survived a grueling birth, a father who lived to 50 despite a healed spear wound, and an elder who was cared for by their children even when they could no longer contribute to the hunt. These people weren't primitive in their will to live. They were just operating in a world where the margin for error was zero. Every gray hair on an ancient skull was a hard-won trophy in a game where the house always had the advantage. It's easy for us to feel a bit superior when we look back at this. We live in an era where we can cure an infection with a pill and fix a broken heart with a bypass. Most of us today have a minor existential crisis if the Wi-Fi goes down for 10 minutes or if our favorite brand of coffee is out of stock. Meanwhile, your ancestors spent millions of years worrying if a single splinter or a rainy season would be the end of their story. They did the heavy lifting of surviving the infancy gauntlet and the infection trap so that we could eventually live long enough to worry about things like credit scores and retirement funds. In the end, our ancestors didn't die at 30 because they were weak. They lived shorter lives because they were the pioneers of a world that was still trying to kill them at every turn. They survived long enough to pass on their genes and their knowledge, ensuring that we would one day have the brains to invent the very medicine they lacked. On the bright side, at least back then, you never had to worry about saving for a 40-year retirement, mostly because retirement usually meant you finally became too slow to outrun a hyena. It's a dark joke, but it's the truth. They lived fast and died hard so that we could live long and get bored. And honestly, considering the alternative, being bored at 80 is a luxury that every single one of your ancestors would have traded a mammoth for. At least today, when your tooth hurts, the only thing you have to worry about dying is your bank account.